So let's get to it this morning. I've been looking forward to this day for a long time. I had the privilege of meeting Brandan at a conference last March. I was very familiar with his work before then, and meeting him just reinforced the fact to me. And I don't say this about. I don't know that I've said this about anybody else. Actually, I think that God has touched Brandan in a special way. I think that God has called him to do something special in our culture, and that God has raised him up, and that God is going to continue to raise him up. I think as we welcome our guests this morning, I think we're seeing the beginning of something mind-boggling that God is going to accomplish in our time. And I couldn't be more thankful. Brandan is an inspiration to me personally. I can tell you the Brandan that you see in the press and in the media is the same Brandan you see in real life. And that means the world to me. I have seen the effects of people finding hope through Brandan, people who have been tempted to give up, and God is working through him. You know what God's doing? Resurrecting hope and faith and joy in people's lives. That's what God's doing through Brandan. And so I want to give him a formal introduction and then a very warm welcome. So Brandan Robertson is a progressive evangelical writer, activist, speaker, and spiritual entrepreneur who's committed to getting Jesus a second hearing among the cynical, skeptical, burned, and spiritual but not religious people. He desires to build bridges across cultural, theological, and political divides and to help others rethink, reform, and renew what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus in our postmodern world. Brandan has a BA in Pastoral Studies and Bible from Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and is pursuing a Master's of Theological Studies at Wesley Theological Seminary. He writes for Revangelical, Huffington Post, Red Letter Christians, Sojourners, Project Awaken, and Impact Magazine. Has been featured as a contributor to a number of well-read outlets such as Time Magazine, XO Jane, and Dallas Morning News. He's a frequent guest on numerous nationally syndicated radio programs and television networks such as MSNBC, The Drew Marshall Show, State of Belief, The Takeaway on NPR, and Stand Up with Pete Dominic. Brandan's work has been profiled in a number of prominent newspapers and magazines, including Time, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, The Oregonian, and Religion News Service. Brandan is the host of Project Awaken, a podcast, and is also a sought-after consultant to churches, denominations, and faith-based organizations on issues of faith, the millennial generation, and issues surrounding religious, cultural, and political divides. Brandan serves as the director of the Rise Network. He also serves on the board of Evangelicals for Marriage Equality and as an initiator for the Convergence Initiative that we're a part of as well here. Brandan currently resides in Washington, D.C. So, I want you to give a very warm One Church welcome to our brother, Brandan Robertson. Come on up.
Thank you so much. Oh my, One Church. Let me just tell you for a second that it is honestly so good to be here with all of you. I've been watching your church for probably 2 years now, and just been amazed that in the middle of the desert here in Phoenix, there is this new thing happening, this new progressive church that's reaching such a diverse group of people. And what you're doing here is honestly an example to churches all around the country. And I'm just so blessed to finally be here with you guys. So you've been in a series talking about the power of story. And as Christians, we come from a tradition that values story almost above anything else. From the very beginning, we've been a people committed to giving witness to God and how God has worked in our lives and in the world around us. And our stories as people of faith have been the primary way that we've communicated truth to others and helped them wake up to the thing that God is doing in our world. Jesus himself, when he commissioned his disciples, sent them out to be witnesses, in other words, to tell his story and what they had witnessed when they walked with him. And if any of you, like me, come from a Baptist tradition, storytelling, or testimonies as we like to call it, we took it to a whole new level. In the Fundamentalist Baptist Church I grew up in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, we had whole church services dedicated to giving testimonies. We loved to testify. Most of us told genuine stories. Some of the older church ladies would get up and do it just to gossip. But nonetheless, we testified. We were storytelling people. And so what is it about story in the Christian tradition that is so powerful? I think the first thing is that stories can't be denied. No one can deny what you have experienced. When you tell somebody about a personal encounter with God or an experience you had, no matter what they believe or think, they cannot deny what you yourself have seen. So often as humans, our beliefs, our thoughts, our conceptions of reality are challenged by our own personal experiences and the experiences of those around us. And we think we've figured out the world, we've systematized our theology, we've gotten our politics nailed down, and then we meet somebody who tells us a story, and it rocks our entire paradigm. Because again, no matter what you think, believe, or know to be true, it can't stand against a story, the power of a story. Jesus told stories to illustrate the deepest truths of our universe. And as human beings, created in the image and likeness of a divine storyteller, we have been wired at our deepest level to tell stories and to learn truth through stories. From the very first words of Genesis, all throughout the Hebrew oral tradition, through the Gospels, our scriptures, our tradition is all about stories. There's something intrinsically human and even something divine about telling stories. And when we come together to share our journey, we make up a large, beautiful story together. And when we hear each other's stories, we learn and find encouragement and strength to keep pressing forward in ours. So I say all of that as a preface, things that you all already know. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to sum up 23 years of life. So stick with me. I'm going to try to stick. I have this outline to tell you my life journey. I might go all over the place. Chronological order might be messed up, but we'll see what we can do. And it's my hope that today, as I just tell you a little bit about how I've gotten to be where I am today, sitting here on a stool in Phoenix, Arizona, talking to you this morning, what has taken me here, I hope you would find some encouragement for your journey. So let's start back at the very beginning. June 24th, 1992, Silver Spring, Maryland. I was born to a very blue-collar family. My mom was a medical student. My dad was a guy who laid carpet for a living. And I was born into a family that had struggled for generations with abuse and alcoholism. And so I was born with a father who struggled deeply with alcoholism and being an abusive person towards my mother and my brother. And that was how I first experienced the world. Within about 4 years, the first 4 years of my life, we moved out of my grandfather's house where we were living, and we moved to one of the wealthiest counties in the country, a place called Howard County, Maryland. And we were a upper, lower class family living in the midst of the wealthiest county in the United States in a trailer park. And so in the midst of this environment, I was surrounded by 600 other trailers with 600 other families who all had similar backgrounds to mine, abusive fathers or mothers or absent parents or alcoholism or drug abuse. That was the world that I emerged into. And as you can imagine, as someone growing up in an environment where year after year I witnessed my father verbally, physically abusing my mother, and eventually verbally, physically abusing me, that wears on a young soul. And so by the age of 12, I found myself literally at the end of my rope. At 12 years old, I still remember to this day waking up every single morning, and the first thought that would be in my head was, is today going to be the day that I end my life? Because I had been taught, based on the community I lived in, with a bunch of other kids my age who were in abusive environments, but also in the family I lived in, that there was no hope and future for someone like me. This was what reality was like. And I had no vision. No one in my family had gone to school, graduated from college. My dad had a middle school education. I never thought I had any hope or opportunity in life. But something strange happened that turned everything upside down. About 5 trailers up from my house was this crazy religious family. And when I say crazy religious, I mean these were the whole deal. They wore long dresses, went to church 3 times a week, held vacation Bible school at their house. They'd come knocking on doors once a week, handing out gospel tracts to the neighbors. These were crazy, fundamentalist people. That's how we understood them in the neighborhood. That's how we talked about them. I had no clue what was going on up in that house 5 trailers up until I became best friends with the 2 daughters of this family. And as I started hanging out with Abigail and Hannah, they, like good fundamentalists, extended the invitation for me to come to church with them. And so as a 12-year-old in an abusive environment, living in this trailer park, couldn't get away on the weekends, going to church sounded like vacation. And so I took the first opportunity I could to get out of my home on the weekend, and I said, yes, of course I'll come to church on Sunday, not knowing at all what I was getting myself into. And so I ended up that Sunday morning wandering down the street to their house, getting in the car with my clip-on tie that I just went out the day before and bought because my mom was horrified that I had no church clothes to wear. And I ended up in this fundamentalist Baptist church right outside of Baltimore. At first, it seemed pretty normal. I went to Sunday school, I hung out with Abigail and Hannah, I made new friends. But as I continued to go to this church, I began hearing a message about God, about sin, about heaven and hell, and I began to feel convicted. And more than the sin messages and the hell messages, I also heard about a God who was a better father than my father, a God who could love me better than I was loved by my parents. And as a 12-year-old boy, one Sunday, during a kind of revival service the church had, I made my way down the old aisle, I kneeled, and with tears in my eyes, I gave my life to Christ, as we had put it. And what I experienced there that day in that fundamentalist church fundamentally changed my life. Because what I experienced there wasn't religious theology, doctrine. It was a legitimate encounter with the divine. God was present there in a way that I had never experienced, never knew was possible. And I used to say in a moment my life was changed. Looking back over the past 10 years, I know it's taken a little bit longer than that. But what happened at that moment was hope was born in my young heart. And the suicidal boy who had no hope and no future was now a part of a community and now believed in a God that gave me potential and gave me a hope and a future. And so I started going to church regularly, and when I got saved, I got really saved. So within 4 months of becoming a Christian, I felt God calling me to become a pastor, and so I started a church service in my backyard, invited all the neighborhood kids to come every week. Every Thursday night, you could find me on the streets of Baltimore preaching against the dangers of homosexuality and abortion. I started a blog at 13. I self-published 2 books by the time I was 16. I was all in. This God thing changed my life, and I wanted to give my life to becoming like the TV preachers I watched every morning before school. And I honestly believed that this message I heard, that this encounter with God I had, was something I wanted other people to experience. And so, nonetheless, I still lived in this secular environment. I still went to public school. And so imagine this newly converted fundamentalist boy who wore a 6-inch wooden cross around my neck every morning and decided I had to stop talking to my friends who listened to hip-hop music. I would go to church, or go to school every week and evangelize. I was known as, they literally called me BB King, which stood for Bible Bringing King. I don't know we'll just leave that where that's at. I would walk around the hallways of my school with a big King James Version Bible, my gospel tracts, and I'd sit down with my Muslim friends and my Jewish friends and my Mormon friends, and I'd open up the Bible and I'd tell them why Muhammad was a false prophet and why Joseph Smith was crazy and why Catholics worshipped Mary and the Pope and all the other crazy things that I believed as a young fundamentalist who had no religious education whatsoever. And what I found at this young age, as I was evangelizing my Muslim and Mormon and Jewish and gay and everything in between, that I was the one who started getting evangelized to. There was this one guy named Jeremy who was in my German class, and Jeremy was the other fervent evangelist in our school. He was a Mormon. And me and Jeremy, by God's providence, sat next to each other in German class, and within about 10 minutes, he had his Book of Mormon out, and I had my Bible out, and we were comparing notes. And Jeremy and I decided that we were going to convert each other. And so Jeremy sent the Mormon missionaries to my house, and I went to Jeremy's house, and we just started this dialogue. And I was convinced at this time, as this young 12-year-old fundamentalist, that I had truth. I had found all of the answers. And yet, as I'd sit and talk to Jeremy and talk to the Mormon missionaries, I realized that there was something in what they were saying that I was supposed to disagree with, and yet I sensed the movement of God's Spirit even in them. Another experience was in home economics class. I sat at a table with Saima and Ahmed, two Muslims. And these were not quite as fervent as I was in my evangelism. They were pretty hardcore. And so we would sit at our home economics table, and they bought me a Quran, I bought them a Bible, and we would sit there and wrestle through the texts together. We'd meet after school and talk. And what I found as they told me about Islam, even though I knew what the Bible said, and I knew all of the apologetic answers, and I thought Allah was a moon god, that's what I was taught in my fundamentalist church, in my apologetics classes, and I would tell them all of this stuff, and yet I would hear what they were saying, and I'd hear about their experience with God, and I'd hear about the beauty of them leaving class to pray 5 times a day, and I was blown away that it seemed like they knew the same God that I was talking about, that I was experiencing. It seemed that they had some truth that maybe I didn't have, or a different way of talking about the same thing that I believed. And this was pretty crisis-inducing for a 12-year-old fundamentalist street preacher. And in the midst of all of this, curiosity was born in my heart. And I continued to study and read and do everything I could. I watched the Discovery Channel every week around Easter time, especially about all the documentaries about Jesus and the Bible. And I was just so committed to learning more than what my fundamentalist church was telling me. It was also at the same period that I remember walking into my fundamentalist Baptist church one Sunday and noticing a guy in the back pew and noticing something in me move towards attraction. And in that moment, as a young teenager fundamentalist, I realized that this attraction to this guy who was sitting in church, I thought it was the most demonic thing that could happen to me. I thought it was going to end my career as a pastor, that it was going to cut me off from God. And I remember feeling that attraction the first time and praying, God, take this from me. If this is going to be my life, end it now, because I can't walk down this path. This path will lead me to destruction. I can't go here. And so I spent time praying about my sexuality, keeping it really on the DL, never talked to anyone about it. I ended up dating one of the cheerleaders from our church's school's team, which is weird that a fundamentalist school had a cheerleading team. Think about that. But I dated her, and it was lovely. We had a great relationship, and I suppressed all of these questions about sexuality throughout my entire high school experience. By the time I was 16, my curiosity had led me to a popular YouTube preacher by the name of Mark Driscoll. And if you know anything about Mark Driscoll, he was this pastor from Seattle who's basically a fundamentalist, but he cussed, drank, had tattoos, listened to rock music. And so as a young fundamentalist, I found this YouTube preacher named Mark Driscoll. And he showed me a new way to hold all of my beliefs, but do all the things that all my friends at school were doing. And so I started getting into Mark Driscoll and his theology, which is called Calvinism, and I got really hardcore into that movement. And I would go back to my Baptist youth group and tell my youth pastor about what I was learning. And immediately I was told that what I was saying was heresy, and that if I kept talking about it, I'd be kicked out of the church. And so weeks went by, and I still couldn't shake what I was learning from Mark Driscoll, and I had heard from one of my friends that the youth pastor had said in Sunday school, told the youth group to stop talking to Brandon because I was dangerous because of what I was believing and saying. And eventually I ended up getting called into the pastor's office because of this and a number of other issues. And the pastor basically said, Brandon, we're so glad you have been here, but you can't be here anymore. This church is not an environment for you. Don't ask us for help. You need to leave. And so I'm 16 years old. This is the first church, the only church I've ever been a part of. This thing that had changed my life so radically, I, as a 16-year-old boy, walked out of that church hysterical. And I didn't know if I was ever going to go back to church. But what I did know was that I had encountered something. Something had changed my life. The hope that was born in me was undeniable. And so after a month or so, I wandered into a mega church that was just down the street from my house. And I thought this mega church was heretical because they had drums and guitars and lights and used the NIV Bible instead of the King James Version and let women preach and all of the other stuff. And I walked in with so much defense. And what I found at that church was a community of people who also, a lot of them came from that fundamentalist world and had found a more gracious way of being Christian. Still conservative evangelicals, but a more gracious way to live out their faith. And that church took me under their wings. And throughout the rest of high school, I was mentored in this beautiful community. And in that church, we had 5 pastors that graduated from a school called Moody Bible Institute. And so it seemed natural that as somebody who wanted to be a pastor, that I should go to where all of my pastors went, and I applied. I thought Moody was actually a progressive school, because before I was going to Moody, the schools I was applying to were places like Bob Jones University and Pensacola Christian College. If you know anything about them, these are kind of these bastions of fundamentalism. Guys and girls have to walk on opposite sides of the campus still, and like hardcore right-wing Christianity. And Moody, I read on their website that they let guys and girls hold hands. And so I was like, man, these people are liberals. I've got to go here. So I ended up walking onto campus at Moody Bible Institute in fall of 2010, still a young Mark Driscoll fundamentalist. I was the ideal up-and-coming evangelical pastor guy. I was everything that I was supposed to be. But if you know anything about Moody Bible Institute, it is right in the heart of downtown Chicago. Out of my 7th floor window for the 4 years I lived there, I looked out and I would see the Sears Tower. It was the best piece of real estate in all of Chicago. But because of that, it's really hard to have a conservative fundamentalist-leaning school in the midst of a place with so much diversity and so much culture and so much exposure to things that we as young fundamentalists had never encountered before. So, within the first couple weeks of being at Moody, I just decided it was time to find a church. But instead of going to the Baptist church down the road, me and a couple guys decided that we were going to start visiting different churches because we'd never had that experience before. So we started visiting Catholic churches and Orthodox churches and Mormon churches, and we went to a synagogue. And one Sunday we walked into a church just a few blocks from Moody, and we thought this was actually an evangelical church, and we walked in, didn't know what we were getting into, sat down, and I realized that in the pew in front of me there were 2 women holding hands. And as a young freshman at Moody, I'd never seen this in a Christian environment before, and I remember looking at my friends, and we said, should we leave? Is this one of those kind of churches? Just when we were thinking that, the service started, and a woman got up to the pulpit. And she began to preach, and at that moment, we had gay Christians sitting in front of us and a woman pastor in the pulpit. Everything in us said, we need to get up and leave. We are in the church of Satan. But for some strange reason, we didn't have it in us to get out of the second row and walk out. And so we stayed. And that woman pastor preached a sermon that was the most gospel-centered, spirit-rich sermon I'd ever heard, honestly, to this day. And after that service, that lesbian couple came up to us, and we talked to them, and everyone knew we were Moody because we were the only people in the church with ties and big Bibles. And that couple overflowed with the love of Jesus, which sounds so cliche, and yet you've met those people that just have that connection to God in a way that it overflows. And I was thrown, my whole paradigm was threatened in this moment, because here were 2 things that could not exist in my worldview. You could not be a woman pastor. God would not work with you if you were that. And you could not be a gay Christian. And yet, here they were. And so this sent me spiraling out of control. And so what I did what every other millennial does. I started blogging. And I decided to write about these experiences and start to interview people with different theology and different worldviews. And so I started reaching out to people like N.T. Wright, if you're familiar with him, or Tony Campolo. These people are kind of gateway drugs into heresy in the evangelical world. And I just started having conversations, both through a blog and a podcast, talking to people that were different than me. And the more conversations I had, the more experiences I had with these heretics, the more I discovered they loved Jesus more than I did, that they were connected to God in more profound ways than anybody else I knew in my environment. And my entire paradigm continued to shift. And so, on our campus, me and my small group of friends who were involved in all of this searching and discovery were kind of known as these outcast, heretical people. Why are you blogging? Why are you talking to N.T. Wright? Don't you know he doesn't believe the Bible? And so we continued to do that until about the end of the semester. I announced that I was going to interview a guy named Brian McLaren. And at that same time, after talking to people for a semester, my views on politics started to shift. And I actually became affirming of civil marriage equality, which was a huge shift, but it wasn't a theological one. And so I figured it was fine. And so on the same day, on my Facebook, I announced that I was going to interview Brian McLaren, and Maryland had just passed civil marriage equality, and I posted an article in favor of that. And within an hour, I had an email in my inbox saying, you need to come meet with the dean of students, your show is canceled, and we're not sure you can stay at this school. So I got called into the dean's office, and I was run through a theological inquisition, if you will. They asked me, what do you believe about hell? The same thing that I've always believed about hell. My theology hasn't changed. What do you believe about homosexuality? The same thing I've always believed. My theology hasn't changed. Just because I talked to Brian McLaren, just because I talked to N.T. Wright, just because I went to the church with the woman pastor, doesn't mean I've abandoned my faith. It just means I'm talking to people that have different perspectives than me. And they couldn't really argue with that in principle. At Moody, you could be kicked out. When you come into the school, you sign a theological statement, and you have to sign that same statement when you leave. Now think about that. In 4 years of education, you're expected to not have any theological change. So I could be kicked out if my theology did change significantly. It hadn't. And so I was told, you're going to continue to stay here, but we're going to watch you, and you will be held accountable for what you say or what you do, and if your theology changes. Now, as you can imagine, that's a traumatic experience. And so I walked out of that office, and this is the second time I felt like I was being kicked out of a faith community. And I was heartbroken and cynical. And so that's when I relaunched my blog. This time I called it Revangelical. And I said, I'm going to reform this thing. And Revangelical stood for Rethinking, Reforming, and Renewing the Evangelical Faith. And I went full force. For about a semester, I became the most liberal person. I was like the Glenn Beck on the liberal side. I would spew off the most liberal things just to piss Moody people off. Because that's where my soul was at that point. I was like, if you're going to try to kick me out for learning and for conversing with people that were different and conversing with people that I now know had the Holy Spirit and loved Jesus just like we did, then stick it to the man. And that's what I tried to do. And, of course, that was not a very productive method in that environment. And I got called into a number of other meetings. At the same time, I met a friend at Moody who took me out for coffee. He was an upperclassman. And while we were at coffee, he got a very serious look on his face and said, Brandon, I've not told too many people this, but I want to tell you that I struggle with same-sex attraction. And that was the first time in years that I'd heard that. That was actually probably the first time in a religious context I'd ever heard of somebody else in a place like Moody admitting to struggling with same-sex attraction. And I had suppressed it for years. I hadn't thought about it. But in that moment, I looked at him across the table in the midst of all of this chaos and turmoil, and I said, I do too. And it was like Pandora's box opened up. Because now not only was my theology shifting and my world shifting, but now this thing that I'd hidden, this fundamental part of who I was now exposed. And within the next probably 3 months, I was a part of the men's choir at Moody, and so stereotypically in a men's choir, there were lots of people that struggled with same-sex attraction. And about Between my dorm floor and the men's choir, about 12 people admitted their struggle to me. And my world continued to get blown up because here, surrounding me, were people that had given their lives to serve God in ministry who struggled with this thing that marked us as reprobates. And so, as a young fundamentalist, I was talking to all of these progressive leaders who were saying, it's okay, the Bible doesn't actually condemn this, but I was still an evangelical Christian and I still believe what Moody said. And so I did the only thing I knew how to do, and I went to professors for advice. And I walked into one professor's office, and she lovingly listened to everything I had to say. She turned to Amazon.com and bought me a 800-page reparative therapy textbook and said, Brandon, I'm buying you this as a gift. I want you to read this. I think this will help you. And also, next door, there's another professor who does something called healing prayer, which works to heal your soul from same-sex attraction. I want you to do that. And if you don't do that, we're going to really question your integrity. Because I was already the subject of a lot of skepticism at Moody because I was asking all these questions, talking to all these people, and so they said, if you want to prove that you're not this heretic that's infiltrated our system and is trying to destroy the kingdom of God, I want you to read this book and go next door and start meeting with this professor. And so I did. And for my senior year at Moody, I started meeting with this woman and did this thing called healing prayer, which sought to heal my soul from my same-sex attraction. Now, I'm actually quite lucky because healing prayer is not reparative therapy in the way that most of us would think of reparative therapy. And healing prayer actually proved to be really helpful for me. It was this experience of going back and reliving trauma and seeking healing in the midst of it. And so I did that for a year, and I found myself getting more whole and healed, and I became more of a person than I was before, and I was more confident. The problem was, as I became more whole as a person, my sexuality only was solidified. And so I come to the end of my Moody career. There had been 6 more times meeting with professors and deans about my theological fitness. And this professor who had been performing this healing prayer on me kind of knew that it worked, but it didn't work. And by God's grace, somehow, I walked across that stage in May of 2014 and graduated. And I had no clue where I was going or what I was doing. I was in a place where I wasn't sure if I could still be an evangelical Christian. I didn't know what was going to happen with my sexuality. My theology still was pretty static. And so I walked out of Moody, and it was my goal to move to Washington, D.C., start seminary, and figure all of this out. Take a couple years just to get out of all this public blogging and podcasting and just figure my life out. Instead, I decided 2 weeks before seminary started to not go to seminary, and I accepted a job as the national spokesperson of Evangelicals for Marriage Equality. A good way to go for somebody trying to figure out their sexuality, isn't it? And so within about a 2-week period, I was thrust into a public spotlight as one of the leading evangelical advocates for civil marriage equality. And in the midst of all of this time, that summer outside of Moody, I had a lot of time to be formed. And I'd come to a point where I realized that my experience at Moody, though it was toxic and harmful, and though what I was experiencing at the church, at the fundamentalist church as a young boy, was really bad and it was injustice, that those people that did those things didn't do it because they were evil, bigoted people, but they did it because they honestly worked for them, and that it would be a waste of my life and my energy if I left Moody and spent the next 50 years rebelling against evangelical Christianity. And I had known over my time at Moody so many people who were so hurt from evangelical Christianity, and they walked away, but instead of moving on to greater healing and hope, they kind of stood at the doorstep and continued to yell back for the rest of their lives, and it only caused more fracture and more pain. And I said I can't do that. But I was committed to sticking around evangelical Christians and working for change. And so that's why I ended up taking the position as the national spokesperson of Evangelicals for Marriage Equality. And within, like I said, about a month, I had an article in Time magazine announcing our launch. And about a week later, the Southern Baptist Convention released an official article in Time magazine condemning me. Al Mohler, the president of the largest seminary in the world, did a podcast basically saying I didn't know what the Bible said and that my whole ministry was a sham. And here I was, yet again, finding myself with these people who were my idols, who had taught me so much, attacking me. And my theology hadn't changed yet. I was still just talking about civil marriage equality. But in the midst of this period, I started being connected to a number of churches and other evangelicals that were working behind the scenes to shift the way evangelicals viewed same-sex relationships. And I began to sit in meetings with some of the leading evangelicals from around the country who sensed that God's Spirit was doing something new in our midst, and sensed that the view the church had taken on same-sex relationships for decades was harmful and toxic and needed to be abolished. And in the midst of this period where I could have gone to the right and rebelled against Moody and spent the rest of my life in a posture defensive, I discovered that God was doing a new thing in the midst of this people that had caused me so much harm. And so, over the past year, I've had the opportunity to speak and travel and write and meet with gay Christians, and my theology did end up changing. And in February, I came out publicly as queer, and I embraced who God had made me to be, and I began to experience God's power in my life and see God's power moving around me in ways that I'd never experienced before. And to this day, the work that I do primarily is still going and meeting with evangelicals. And what I want to tell you guys here, because I know so many people in this room came from that same background that I came with and have so much of the same pain and baggage that I went through. I came out of that, and today I'm standing here, and I want to let you know that God's Spirit is actually still working in the midst of evangelicalism and in the midst of fundamentalism. And there are some tremendous shifts taking place, and that I really believe in 10 years, evangelical Christianity will not be this toxic force in the world, but will be a place of inclusion and acceptance for all people, because God is really doing something powerful in our midst. And that's been my greatest privilege over this past year. That's brought me the most healing. It's validated my whole journey. As I've gone around the country and I've met people like you, awesome people that have similar backgrounds and similar experiences, who are still connected with God but not sure about the traditions and theologies that we're a part of. God is doing something, and there is this massive transformation that's taking place. And I just come with that message, and that's really what my life has taught me thus far. And I want to break it down real quickly as we close in 3 lessons from all of those crazy experiences. That was my attempt at telling my story in 20 minutes, so sorry if it was a little convoluted, but I think the first big thing that I learned in the midst of all of that is that everything belongs. In the early days of my faith, I spent so much time on my knees in my bedroom as that abused young boy, crying to God and saying, God, why me? Why would you put me in an abusive family? Why would you make me queer? Why would you make me an evangelical? Why would I have to endure all of this pain and scrutiny? And in the midst of my darkest hours, I reached out to God and cried, why? How many of us in this room have been there? Everyone has gone through that same pain and despair, and we will continue to go through that pain and despair because that's part of life. But very early on, God's Spirit worked in me to tell me that all of my pain, all of the hurt, all of the abuse, all of the rejection, all of the injustice had a place. Now, that doesn't justify it. God doesn't ordain or desire us to be in pain or to face injustice or abuse. God doesn't delight in it, and nor should we. But that pain exists, and when it emerges in our lives, it's there with a purpose. It will be redeemed, and it will be recycled. The darkness will be turned to light. The hurt will be turned to joy. I thought back as a young boy, one of the stories that inspired me the most was the story of Job, who lost everything in the Bible. His family, his friends, his health died, went away. In the midst of Job's pain, he cried out this powerful line, when all of this is complete, I will come forth as gold. And he's talking about a refining fire, that when a metallurgist puts a piece of fine metal into a fire, it refines it and it takes off all the dross, and when it comes out on the other side, it's shinier and more valuable than before. And that is what happens in our life. We will face injustice at the hands of people claiming the name of God, and we will face abuse And none of that is good, and none of that is right, and none of that is justifiable. But all of that belongs. All of that can serve to strengthen you and empower you and bring you out on the other side. We can allow that to be the end. We can allow that to be our story. I can go around and be the guy who was abused by evangelicalism. Or we can allow that to say, in the midst of all of that, I think God has something bigger for me. I think there is more to life. I can move forward. There is a brighter future. And that's so true. And it's my hope that all of us can come to a place with all of the pain that we've gone through to realize that all of that has a place. And it doesn't have to be the end of the story. The second lesson is always take the first step. Normally when I go around and talk about my story, I couch it in the story of Abram from Genesis chapter 12. God comes to Abraham in the book of Genesis, gives him a call, says, listen to me, it's time for you to leave this land that you're in and go into an unknown land that I will show you. And if you do, you'll be blessed. That's all Abram gets. Verse 4 of Genesis chapter 12, the next verse after God says that, it says, so Abram departed. This is what makes Abraham the prophet that is lauded in the world's three biggest religions. This is what makes Abram the example of faith. That he heard this call, this internal nudge to move forward, to keep going, and he took the step forward and did it. I believe that God is always speaking to us. And for most of us, that voice of God is not some audible Morgan Freeman-esque voice, but it's that small internal voice that's barely distinguishable from our own voice. God is calling and talking to each of us every day, whether it's a small thing like go talk to that person, or a bigger thing like go start that business. God is talking to us and speaking to us. And the major reason I was able to rise above my circumstances, to be the first person in my family to graduate from college, to get to be a writer, to get to go around and speak, is because I decided to trust in God and not on my own perception of reality. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and not on your own understanding. In everything you do, acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And that scripture has been a source of encouragement for me for the past 10 years of my life. That in every situation, when it looks like it's the end, when it looks like you can't go on any further, God is still working. God is still moving. And if we listen to his call and take that first step into the unknown land, into the scary place, beyond our boundaries, beyond our comfort, we will be blessed and will be made a blessing. And I've experienced that time and time again in my life. And the last thing I want to encourage you with is to never stop moving. No matter what circumstance happens on our journey, we must keep going ahead. We must not strive for satisfaction or permanence. No matter how certain we've become that we found all the right answers and all the right political positions, we must keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep turning over new stones and allowing our wonder to be expanded. We live in an ever-expanding universe. We worship an infinite, eternal, expanding God. We sang about it earlier today. We will never run out of things to explore or questions to ask. We will never find satisfaction. We will never be home, because that's not the point. When we speak about God, we're speaking about that wild, untamable spirit that blows and flows through the world, animating, giving life to all things. God is at work in all people at every moment. There is so much to explore. May we reject our desire for certainty and for rightness, for comfort and satisfaction, and take that first step to the land that God has promised to show us. Because when we do, we will be led into uncharted territories, unexplored realities, and that is what life is all about. Not arriving at home. I don't think I'll ever arrive at a place that I can call home. But wandering around, winding through the roads of life. This is a sign of a vibrant life, of a healthy faith. In the words of my man, Pope Francis, life is a journey. When we stop, things don't go right. So much is happening in our lives and in our world, and we need to keep pressing forward, keep wandering, keep exploring, keep responding to those subtle promptings and nudges, Because, friends, there is more. No matter what you feel, no matter how terrible the experiences have been, and I know they've been terrible for many of us, there is more beyond that. There is more hope. There is more love. There is a better world, and we can actually achieve it. That's what Jesus was all about when he talked about the kingdom of God. It's that world that we can create together when we refuse to stop in our ruts and stop in our pain, and instead to continue to move forward, seeking a better world. Life isn't about the answers. It's not about having the right systematic theology. It's about wonder, living in radical amazement that we get to be here in this world. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once said, I didn't ask for success, I asked for wonder. Wondering as we wander. Wondering at the bigness and beauty of it all. Continually moving ahead and exploring the depths and mysteries of God. That's what gives us the meaning and the purpose in life. We'll never arrive, friends, but that's the point. Life is a journey, and we must keep moving, abandoning our comfort, leaving fear behind, heeding the Spirit's call, and taking that leap. So One Church, in the hodgepodge of everything I just said in the last 35 minutes, those are some of the lessons I've learned along the way. And I want you to know that I am so encouraged as I continue on in the world, knowing that as a nomad wandering through these deserts of life, I'm with a caravan of people like you guys. Last night I sat at dinner table with a bunch of One Church people and heard stories of pain and trauma, but heard stories of hope and reconciliation and a future. And that is what it's all about. Keep going, because there is more. The world is getting better. Justice is rolling like a river. And there is a better tomorrow. And I honestly believe that, and I want you to believe that with me. So let's keep pressing forward together.